If you're not training kids from a young age what healthy drinking looks like, and then when they turn 20 and they're just doing an exaggerated version of what the men in their shul did, why are you surprised? This is what you've trained them to think is normal. That's really the solution that you're talking about, is that we need to get more honest. We need to realize that alcohol is a serious thing, that we can't just ignore it, and that having dry shuls is not necessarily the most effective solution. Never having alcohol is not necessarily the solution. I'm not advocating to have alcohol or not to have alcohol, but if you get rid of all the alcohol in your shul, you haven't necessarily solved the problem, because a lot of shuls that have no alcohol in it have a house across the street where men are doing the exact same thing. And they're reducing the sanctity of what it means to be a Jewish person. They're disrespecting what it means to use alcohol in an elevated passion or even in a permitted passion. It's no longer about connecting, it's about disconnecting. It's no longer about elevating, it's about degrading. It's no longer about moving towards, it's about running away. There's that space where it stops being about, I want to have a spiritual experience and use alcohol to help me get there. And it's more about the alcohol is the spiritual experience.
This is Listening to Understand, where sensitive Jewish truth seekers gather in a safe place for candid conversations on challenging topics. When we listen to truly understand and not in order to respond, we can replace judgment with curiosity and open our hearts to every Jew, regardless of their personal choices. As Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. I'm Atana. Let's get started.
Is public alcohol abuse out of control at Kiddushim and Shuls? Should communities and Rabbonim set alcohol boundaries in Shul at Kiddushim? Are we role modeling good behavior for our children? Do we understand the difference between using alcohol responsibly and irresponsibly in Judaism? Menachem Poznansky is a licensed clinical social worker specializing in addictions treatment and recovery support. Menachem is director of The Living Room, a clubhouse program for Jewish young adults in recovery from addiction, and editor-in-chief of The Light Revealed, a content publisher serving the Jewish recovery community. Menachem is the author of 3 books and hosts the podcast Consciously. Menachem weighs in on the need for individuals to critically examine their beliefs and behaviors. Excessive alcohol consumption is something that we need to take accountability for and need to recognize personal limits and ownership of our actions and not let alcohol be an excuse for irresponsible behavior. Introducing our children to responsible alcohol consumption in moderation could be a good step to changing the accepted norms. And now your host, Matana.
I'm very excited about this conversation. I was just saying a few minutes before I went online, I always do a little meditation, and I was asking myself, what is my deep-rooted trauma with addiction, since I didn't grow up with anyone in my core family that was addicted to anything, and maybe my perception of addiction is wrong, but I'm very grateful to have the guru of addiction, Menachem Poznansky. Thank you very much for joining me here.
I'm grateful to be here. Grateful to have an opportunity to share.
I'm grateful that you're a fellow podcaster, so it's so much easier having these conversations with a fellow podcaster. Right. I was looking at bio and I'm thinking, my God, he does a lot. He does a lot. And he's probably a father and a community member. You have a private practice and a husband and a friend and a human.
So the real question is, what am I running from?
That's funny. That's a classic mental health professional question. But I was looking at what really struck me was that you have your specialty is addiction, recovery from addiction. And I see here that you're a director of The Living Room, which is a clubhouse for those teens and adults that are recovering from addiction. And it looks like I would say, like, where to find the next Jewish Chalent Kiddush, Muncie, Five Towns, Florida, Toms River. You have everything in here, which in a way is inspiring, but in a way it's very sad. That means you have a clubhouse in all of these places for addiction. That means addiction is everywhere.
Yeah, part of what we're learning, The Living Room started off in a Brooklyn location, and then we were drawing people from all over New York, all over the New York area, from Muncie, from the Five Towns, from Queens, obviously, and even some people from Lakewood. But it was hard for them to really participate, so we started to open up like satellites in other areas. And what became clear is that addiction being a very present mental health challenge that many people struggle with, vibrant Jewish communities. One of the things that's really beautiful about the Orthodox community is the Orthodox Jewish community, is that we always tend to create services for when those services are necessary. When there's a large, vibrant community and there's people that require special education. We have different layers of special education support, whether it's embedded classroom support, separate schools. We tend to build those things really well. We tend to take care of our own. And the living room has become a necessity for young adults, mostly young adults. It's not really teens, because it's really people that have encountered the full scale of addiction as it manifests itself. Whereas, meaning we're not an intervention to stop substance abuse per se, but we're really there to help people that have realized that they have an addiction and now want to build a lifetime of recovery, one day at a time. And it's become more and more obvious that that's a resource that's necessary in all of these major Jewish areas so far. Brooklyn, the Five Towns, Muncie, Hollywood, Florida, which kind of covers a lot of South Florida, and Toms River, which is that South Jersey area. And what it does is that what it means is that these major Jewish pockets of population, for those individuals, which is always going to be some segment of the population, 10, 15, 20%, when they want help, there's help for them to be able to access recovery supports and also address the areas that they need. We don't treat addiction. We really are there to support people that are in the process of healing and recovering from a state of acute addiction and then recovering their lives and being a bridge back to life to help them build a beautiful, vibrant Jewish life, which means therapy. It means all the other supports that are necessary, and Judaism, et cetera, all the different things that are necessary for someone to go from a state of abject hopelessness that is acute, present addiction all the way to a place of recovery. So that's what TLR is focused on, and it's a privilege. It's like a gift in my life.
Wow. What is chus to be a vessel for all these people that are trying to find themselves to recover? It's such a chus. I'm understanding. So is it like a 12-step program, AA? It's a AA for the Jewish community?
It's not really that. You could frame it to some degree in that way, but it's really not. It's not meant to replicate the 12 steps. We are very supportive of the 12-step process. I'm a huge proponent of the 12 steps. I think they're genius. That's a whole other podcast, probably, talk about the wisdom that we can glean from the 12 steps and why I'm such a big fan of them. Very effective for somebody, particularly in early recovery, but even throughout their lifetime, to participate in 12-step programs. And we try hard not to be a replacement for that. In many ways, we are a gateway. One of our missions is to help introduce people to healthy 12-step practices, or the practice of the 12 steps in a manner that's healthy and balanced and meaningful and mature, and to help people that are active in the 12 steps connect their 12-step spiritual work with their Judaism, and also to give them an access to 12-step communities that are going on in their areas. But that's only like one part of what we do. A lot of the topics that go on, meaning if you come to the living room at night, you'll get dinner, you'll get hanging out, there'll be counselors there to talk to, and there's also a 12-step meeting or a 12-step style meeting that's facilitated by a staff member. But every meeting starts off by saying, we are not a replacement for AA and NA. If you're in new recovery, if you're in any form of recovery, we really encourage you to find those meetings. If you'd like to find a meeting, let us know. We're happy to help you find one. There's wonderful meetings all over the place. There's also not awesome meetings. 12-step meetings are hard. People don't necessarily realize this. Not every 12-step meeting is the same because they're all autonomous. So each group is alone. Right. So you have some meetings that are really vibrant and full and welcoming and warm, and they're actually really practicing the 12 steps in a vibrant way. And some meetings are not as such. So the people that, when you're in recovery, you want, especially young people, you want them to be accessing those really vibrant, good meetings, so to speak, those really good meetings. And that's part of what we do, is try to connect them with that. And also we replicate meetings within the context of TLR because it's really meaningful for people in recovery to be able to share around other Jewish people. There's things that they can share at a TLR meeting that they can't share at a standard secular meeting. Maybe is a different topic for a different day. Why I don't think that it's useful to create an alternative, but I don't think it's useful. We specifically don't try to create an alternative. There is a reason behind it, I think, but ultimately I think creating a Jewish resource for people that are in recovery is something that we have found is so helpful. So we are a recovery friendly, recovery supportive resource for people that are actively in recovery, but really we're a resource for anybody that's trying to recover from addiction, which is not necessarily limited to 12 steps. So we're aligned, but we're not connected in that way. Does that make sense? Am I
Yeah.
making
Yeah,
it clear?
very much. Very much. For somebody that doesn't understand a lot but knows the terminology, it made a lot of sense to me. And I appreciate that understanding. So I want to give a little bit of a background how I found you. I found you in different I'm very bad with names. I'm very bad with names. Maybe it's because I'm dyslexic, so like my mind doesn't process things the same way other people, but I'm very good with faces. And I recently reached out to my friend Elisheva. Every time I have a big question in healing or spirituality, I'm so grateful that I could just reach out to her and say, "Hey, Elisheva, what do you think about this? Should we make a podcast on this? I need you. I need your insight. I need your brilliance. I need your I need to know what goes on behind closed doors by you, and I need your brilliant mind." So I said to Elisheva, we have to make we share this passion that shuls serve alcohol, a passion against it. I should make it very clear. Passion against the fact that shul abuse alcohol. The Kiddushim, the permission to introduce alcohol on Shabbos, or maybe not even on Shabbos, is something that we're very passionate that something needs to change in this area. And I reached out to her and I'm like, Elisheva, let's make a podcast episode on this for listening to understand, because it's specifically for the Jewish community. And I saw a post that a woman posted in a Jewish group, Women Talk About Anything Jewish, and she was sharing her hardship about her husband coming home from shul every Shabbos, drunk, but not drunk to the degree that people see it, just exhausted, not interested, conked out on the couch, and she's with her 3 or 4 little children at home, waiting, so excited to see her husband, and he's lost on the couch. And this pain of, I want my husband to have an outlet. He works so hard during the week, but then Shabbos turns into this Kiddush club in shul. The amount of response this post got was like, wow, this is not only her, this is a thing. And I remember when I was young, newly married, I was I didn't understand it, because in my house growing up, no one drank alcohol. We didn't even drink, like the Arba Kosos my father got drunk on after Kos Sheni. So it was like, we don't drink. And then no one had a tolerance for alcohol. And it was very strange to me that my husband was going to shul and drinking. And then my kids were going with them when they were young and seeing this. And it was like, it's something that bothered me. And I said, where is this permission coming from? So she said, you need to speak to Menachem. I'm like, wait, I think I heard that name before. And I remembered somebody sharing with me their family member in recovery. And they said there was one person, we went to hundreds of therapists. If there was one therapist that helped and saved our family member's life, was Menachem. So I'm like, wow, how hard is he to get on a podcast? So I'm very grateful. I'm like, if somebody saved somebody's life that was in the pits of hell with addiction to 4 different substances, I'm like, I need to get this person on the podcast, because I feel like you see it all and you understand it all. So now that my background and my passion to this subject, I want to understand your background. What's your passion to recovery? I believe like recovery is something that's forever. It's something it's our whole life is recovery. If it's from substance abuse, from addiction, or from mental illness, or from a trauma of whatever, for someone to devote their life for it, there needs to be a bigger why. What's your why? Why did you get into it?
I mean, like every therapist, I'm a broken healer. So I was just trying to like do my thing. I for whatever reason, God deemed that this should be my shlichus. There's 2 kind of things that bring me to this conversation, because I've had 2 contexts in my professional life. Part of it relates to the work that I've done with individuals in recovery, which I've been very blessed for 20 years to work at the living room with the remarkable people that I have the privilege to work with. Gittel Fallman, who's my partner in the living room, and then also my wife, who's been my life partner in that regard, but then all the other remarkable staff members that I have, and the amazing people that I have the opportunity to work with that are people that are trying to get well and trying to build their lives and trying to recover. in such an acute way. You stated it really well that today the word recovery has broadened to include so many other things because that's a truth. So much of what we're trying to do is to recover our purity, to recover our sense of light, to recover the inner wellspring of goodness that's living inside of us and to allow that to manifest forward. But one of the really powerful things about addiction, and this is part of what fuels my passion, is that people that are in a state of acute addiction are an obvious example. They are a clear example of the opposite of recovery, of a tragic state of being, of a human being that has fallen from a state of free will, from a state of self-actualization, from a state of being their own person to be in a state of slavery, to be in a state of dominance, to be dominated by their own instincts, to be really diminished in almost like I don't mean this like very pejoratively, like very negatively, but in an animal-like state, in the sense that they're operating fully on instincts and they're a slave to those instincts, which is a very like difficult thing. And I think that's one of the things that fascinates people about addiction, because it's like, it's so, on one level, so contrary to what it means to be a human, right? One of the reasons that it's almost sub-animal is because animals don't do things that are bad for them. Whereas an addict, someone who's in a state of addiction, is literally doing something that is self-destructive, but they can't control it. And their pull towards it is coming from the essence of their being. So, for example, addicts will describe to you that in their state of, and I think to a degree all of us as humans experience this, particularly when we get stuck in a destructive habitual pattern, like where it feels like if I don't act out, I'm going to die. I'm going to expire. Even though I know that's not true. And that could be as subtle as someone who's working on speaking Lashon Hara, all the way down to someone who's acting out in a really immoral way. But it feels like if I don't share this little piece of gossip, or I don't say whatever it is, I don't listen to this, I don't hear this, I don't eat this, I can't go on. Even though that's objectively not true. But yet the power of our instinctual and habituated patterns is so overpowering, it overwhelms the system. And like we're left like subject to their whims. And an addict is like a very much an expression of that. They are like the obvious example of that. They're like a beautiful painting of a tragedy, of a disaster. I mean, if you wanted to capture a tragedy in a painting, and a painter was able to do that, and everyone looked at the painting, said, wow, you get trauma. And it's just a picture. It's like it expresses the idea without really understanding it. It says in visuals what you can't say in words. And in many ways, a drug addict, an addict is that. We're like looking at that. We're looking at somebody who's tragically fallen from that like majestic place of humanity. But then watching somebody on the other end, right? And people don't fall into that. Sorry, I don't mean to make a jumbled statement. People don't fall into that pattern in a vacuum. 99% of people don't fall into that pattern in a vacuum. Surely there are people that become addicted to something and fall into that state out of nowhere with no other past history of trauma that didn't affect it. It happens, right? I don't think it's like appropriate to every single person. But for the most part,
you're saying most addiction is out of pain?
Not necessarily. Okay. Out of pain in some vantage point, but it's not all. I'm not one of those people that wants to blame all addiction on trauma, for example. Okay. Trauma is something that's I'm very passionate about. I'm someone who thinks through a lens of trauma, but I also, anyone who listens to my podcast even more specifically recently, have been talking about like how we can't fall into the trap of only looking at things through the lens of trauma, right? So there's other things. Now, depends on how you want to frame trauma, but there's like a lot of people that encounter addiction also lack certain fundamental skills, or they have certain liabilities, whether it's learning disabilities or just in certain like a liability in executive functioning that doesn't allow them to step forward and have the kind of successes that they need to have. And not so much as a reaction to the pain of that, but because there's no other alternative, they'll oftentimes fall into a pattern of addiction at a state of there's no other alternative. So there's many reasons that people fall into a pattern of addiction. When you watch somebody who emerges from that state, who reclaims their humanity and becomes a person again, who reclaims their free will, so to speak, even within the context of, let's say, a powerlessness, which is maybe something we could talk about another time, but who reclaims their sense of humanity and then has to do the work to address all the layers that led them to where they how they got there, which includes like gaining mastery in areas that didn't come natural to them, or addressing the underlying trauma of those liabilities or other traumas that occurred to them, and then suddenly becomes a real person. Maybe that's not the right way of saying it. Suddenly becomes like a beautiful example of a human being. It takes your breath away. When I watch somebody who like has celebrated, let's say in TLR, like 5 years of recovery, and I remember when they came in and they were like a shell of a human being, and now they're like a beautiful example of a human being. That's something to get addicted to. It's very cool. So like you talk about like, why am I passionate about that? That's one of the reasons I'm passionate about it, because I've seen the result. I've seen what happens when people really do the work and recover and get well, and then become like leaders, and they become sources of support, and they become really powerful examples. So that's part of my passion. Another part of my passion is that in my career as a social worker, I worked in Jewish Family Services and another of other community organizations, and I've had the privilege to speak a number of times. For some reason, communities tend to feel like if you're a mental health professional who works with addiction, you must know something about substance abuse, but those things are not necessarily the same thing. Maybe we'll talk about that. But I've had a lot of opportunity to talk and to meet about intervening for non-addicted substance abuse, which is probably what affects more people. Meaning if we have 10 to 20% of people addicted, that's a large percentage of the population, right? Even if it's 5%, that's a large percentage of the population.
Right.
But a much larger segment of the population is suffering from the consequences of the misuse of alcohol, which is more of what you described. Meaning there are many fathers, let's say, who go to shul, and maybe that's where we can go in some of this conversation, who go to shul and drink a little too much and then miss out on Shabbos afternoon. And that doesn't make them an alcoholic in the sense of what I was talking about before, but it's tragic for an entirely other reason, because we've just taken one of the most beautiful things about a frum life, which is Shabbos, and we've made it into a source of pain for families instead of a source of joy, right? Because of a lack of cognizance and a lack of awareness and a lack of communal maturity about something that's very vital, right? Which is what is the appropriate use, recreational use of alcohol. And because alcohol use, let's say if we're talking about alcohol use in particular, though I think we need to also talk about other use today, especially today because of the mass kind of normalization of marijuana use. But there's the sacrosanct use of alcohol within the context of Yiddishkeit, which maybe I would include obviously making Kiddush, but also maybe even having l'chaim appropriately. But then there's also the permissible recreational use of alcohol, which is maybe having 2 or 3 l'chaims in the right circumstance. And then there's like the objective misuse of alcohol, which is maybe having, and for each person it's different, 5 or 6 l'chaims, to a point where it's not really about loosening up. It's not about connecting. It's now about disconnecting.
Disconnecting on
right,
purpose. Like when will that shot apply that I'm disconnected from my pain and from wherever I am right now that I'm not feeling comfortable in?
Exactly. And then the barrier that has for people that maybe aren't encountering addiction, but are really covering up for the other things, mental illness, trauma, distress about undesirable marriage circumstance or family circumstance, which in and of themselves are so tragic. So when we talk about, so part of my passion is that I've had the opportunity to talk about those things a lot, and I know how important they are, and to not conflate, let's say, like the at-risk phenomenon, which is kids misbehaving and doing risky things. That's A. B, individuals that fall into a pattern of addiction, acute addiction, which is tragic and overwhelming, and all of us experience at some level, but when they experience it, it's a level beyond. And then C, just communal patterns of dysfunction. They're not going to kill anybody per se, or some of them could, but that's not why we're talking about them. We're talking about them because they are reducing the quality of life for everybody, and they're reducing the sanctity of what it means to be a Jewish person. They're disrespecting what it means to use alcohol in an elevated passion or even in a permitted passion. It's no longer about connecting, it's about disconnecting. It's no longer about elevating, it's about degrading. It's no longer about moving towards, it's about running away. There's that space where it stops being about, I want to have a spiritual experience and use alcohol to help me get there, and it's more about the alcohol is the spiritual experience.
Yes. Wow, you said that
Right.
so
So
beautifully.
that's really where it becomes really tragic, and it's easy to conflate all those things together and make them a mess. And that's what happens a lot when we have these conversations. But really, we need to separate those things, even though
Yes.
they correlate, because a lot of people that misuse alcohol become addicts, and a lot of teens that misuse alcohol, misuse out as teens, misuse alcohol as adults, and then many of them become drug addicts, but not all of them. And it would be
Okay.
it's silly almost to utterly conflate that. And so we want to begin to discuss, are we intervening in the sense of addiction, which I think is important? Are we intervening in the sense of communal awareness about what's healthy and normative? And then are we intervening how we're teaching kids, which I think is the biggest tragedy, because it's not so much the father that has 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or whatever shots and then comes home and misses out on Shabbos lunch that really gets to me the most. It's the son or the daughter that watches their
The role
father doing
modeling.
that, and then how tragic.
And what I'm understanding is, and tell me if I'm correct, that you're saying not everybody that abuses substance is an addict. Sometimes there's a relationship between them and sometimes not. And there's a different definition for an addict than someone that abuses substance for any reason, if it's a social, if it's a mental, whatever it is. And you're saying in order to gain understanding, in order how do we can create a better future, we need to understand the core. And if we're going to talk about big umbrellas of just topics and not address the why behind it and the right terminologies, we won't be able to really give information on how to recover or how to walk through it properly and really lead a more meaningful life, a spiritual life. And a lot of times in the Orthodox community, I see there's a big, now with recovery in general, there's more awareness, but there's a big disconnect that there's a huge gap between spirituality and religion. Very often, religion does not include spirituality because spirituality is something within. What you gave the example is as somebody that would feel spiritual, they would say, okay, I'm going to shul because I want to connect to Hashem. This is a growth place. It's Shabbos. Am I hurting myself with my connection to my family or God by this shot? Or, oh, we're in shul, it's a kiddush, it's a Jewish thing, we're going to just take a shot. And no matter what the outcome is, that's a disconnect from spirituality and growth.
Yes, I think you articulated a lot of what I was trying to say very well. I think that it's, in some ways, it's an outgrowth of that disconnection between spirituality and religion. Because you see, when someone has a bearing in spirituality, moving aside the addiction piece, because for addiction, once someone's addicted, that's a different space.
Right.
But let's say we're talking about like communal misuse or communal like distorted views on drinking. Someone who has like a deep sense of a relationship with God, if they're going to, let's say, have a shot before davening or after davening, the appropriate or the meaningful intention is what I really want to do is connect. But there's a barrier here because of a sense of tension or a sense of anxiety, perhaps, but not like at a level that's really dysfunctional. I'm going to have a shot and that's going to loosen me up and allow me to be more myself. That's where the interchange between religion, between religious practice, spirituality, mental health, and right living is connected. So now that's a proper
Right.
use of alcohol. It's a removal of barrier, but it's not the solution. And the real distortion is that when you have a disconnection between spirituality and religion, when religion is just a monotonous thing that I have to do, and I'm not feeling anything for it, so then when I'm drinking, I'm trying to infuse my religious practice with spirituality because it's not already there. So now the alcohol use becomes the spirituality. So it's not a shock that the person has to have 3 shots because one shot's not going to get them where they need to go. One shot, each person for themselves, because people interact with alcohol differently, but one shot is not going to give you the illusion of spirituality. You have to get 5 or 6 shots to have the illusion of spirituality, because spirituality is the capacity for me to be removed from, in a positive way, the skin that covers me from myself, the ability for me to be myself. People talk about drinking or using drugs, and addiction addicts talk about this a lot, to like get comfortable in my skin. But it's not so much about getting comfortable in my skin. It's really about transcending my skin, transcending the external layers of myself to be true, to be myself, to be my spiritual self. And that's really what spirituality is. And that's so much of our religious practice is rooted in that, like the idea of tefillah and singing and nigunim. All of that is about blending our organic, synthetic experience with the layer of our reality that is transcendent of that synthetic experience, meaning it's drawing divinity into the world. But when I haven't drawn divinity in, so all I'm doing is the action that's meant to draw that divinity in, and then I feel very empty. And then suddenly, it's not a shocker that people are misusing alcohol or smoking a lot of weed, or because they're so
They're
disencumbered.
craving something greater
Right.
than them.
Right.
And they can get that boost fast with alcohol, with weed, with psychedelics, with something that's a quick fix versus silence, which is painful and sometimes
Uncomfortable.
unbearable, or even torture for some people that are going through that void of spirituality.
And particularly if there's layers of toxicity or pain underneath, then you get to that place of silence, and then suddenly it's unbearably uncomfortable. And it's
Right.
not a surprise so much about connecting with something higher than themselves. In truth, it's really about being more themselves. That's really underneath that. They just want to be themselves. So many people that have that dysfunctional relationship with alcohol and drugs, whether they're addicted or not, is because they don't feel a sense of bearing with their true self. They don't feel like themselves. So it's not even about experiencing something outside of themselves. It's really about feeling about more themselves. And people that are tapped into spirituality feel like themselves. They feel less encumbered around them. There's a certain sense of a comfort with self, even when we're all in a good place, even when we encounter feelings of insecurity. There's a sense of awareness of what that is and a sense of a connection with ourselves. So it's not surprising that people fall into this pattern of distorted use, because so much of why people drink is to reduce the noise so that I can just be myself. You
Yeah.
talk to people, a lot of people that I just want to go to the party and I don't want to feel anxious. I don't want to feel uncomfortable. I have a few drinks and then suddenly everyone likes me and I like myself. That's not such a bad thing to want that. But isn't it tragic that you've come to rely on that in order to do well, and you've made this very distorted life seem normal? You have these organizations, like Mudim put out a video about Kiddush Club, and everyone watched that video and felt uncomfortable. And then a lot of people watched the video, felt uncomfortable, and then went to shul and did the same thing that next week. How does that happen? And part of it is because there's like a disconnection. Certain ways that we live that are distorted and insane start to feel like the norm. It starts to feel normal. It starts to feel reasonable. Even though if you would show it to us, it would be given a video of it, we'd be like, oh, that's ridiculous. Because when you're the dad who's having 2 extra shots, more than what's really useful, you don't get to see your kid watching you. Most of those dads would
Oh, you
watch
don't have
their
the
kid
camera, you
watch
don't
them.
have the zooming in on you. You don't have that mirror held up. But when there's
Right.
a video, you're like, wait, am I that person? And of course, no one wants to be. They're like, oh, that's not me. It's somebody else. And then
Right.
you could
Or just
say
not aware.
it's painful, or just say I'm choosing to say it's not me because it's too painful to say maybe it's me.
And also, like you said, the silence of not drinking is too uncomfortable. Like sitting at Kiddush and not having the fourth, or the
Yeah.
fifth, the sixth, and getting to that space of elevation and connection where everyone else is going to like that level beyond where you should go, and you're now like you're the what's it called, the wet blanket, who's dry, like holding everybody
Yeah.
down.
Yeah. So, what is addiction? What's your definition of addiction? I'm understanding that what we're going to speak about on this podcast is not addiction. So, I just want to remove it because now you taught me there could be a misuse of alcohol or any substance that's not addiction. So, let's clarify that I should know and others should know.
Yeah, no, just to try not to be too long-winded about it, because it's like obviously something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. So there's really 2 expressions of addiction that are important to express. Part of addiction is a state of being where a person has become so habituated to a substance or behavior that it feels in their body and in their brains biochemically, but also in their sense of identity and also in their sense of ability to manage their emotions, that they cannot live without it. So it's a sense of utter neediness for a substance where if that substance is not present, there's tremendous discomfort. We talked about this discomfort of someone like being silent with themselves. For someone who's addicted, the discomfort of not being with their addiction is overwhelming, right? That's what I would call like an acute state of addiction. And that can happen to almost anybody with repeated misuse of substances. Many people encounter states of addiction where they get to a place where they've really lost the power of choice because not doing that thing or not having that thing feels impossible. Not like just feels in a subtle way, but feels in the entirety of their being because of how important and vital it's become. So that's one part of addiction. That's not necessarily how people normally, let's say, associate an addict, right? 'Cause that type of addiction can exist on many different levels. Like, I'll give you an example. You can have somebody who goes to shul, if we're on this topic, every Shabbos, and they have 5 or 6 shots, which is way too much, and they know it's way too much. But they've become so, and then you can have a friend of his, and he goes to shul every Shabbos, and he has untold amounts. He starts with 5 or 6, but then when he's got a bottle in his talis bag, and he has a few before he walks in, like a real alcoholic. Those two guys, right? They're both having 5 or 6 shots at Kiddush, right? One is like objectively an alcoholic. The other one you wouldn't call an alcoholic, and he's not necessarily, and we're using that as an example because it's somewhat of the topic, he's not necessarily like experiencing severe consequences from that. However, if that person can't go to shul without having those 5 or 6 shots, can't sit at Kiddush with his friends without having that experience, so to some degree they have encountered what it means to be addicted, right? It's just not affecting them as severely. Whereas the other guy has become so addicted that the 5 or 6 is not even close, and he needs to have a few before and a few after and hide and this, and usually it's because he's gotten in trouble. So it's a spectrum. Addiction is a spectrum of a habituated, stuck place in a thing, with a substance or a behavior. That's part of what addiction is. Now, another part of addiction, and this is where mental illness starts to come into play, is there is a certain segment of the population that is extremely susceptible to falling into those patterns, and also tends to fall into those patterns multiple times. And that's what we normally call like addicts.
Like a pattern, you're saying?
There's a continued pattern. Like many people, let's say, will fall into a pattern with, not everybody, but many people will fall into a pattern of unhealthy neediness or habituation with a substance or a behavior at some point in their lives. But when they suffer a severe enough consequence, they will realize this is a real problem. They'll go get help. And what will happen is the normal bodily system will kick in, and then they won't want to do that thing again. Those people encountered addiction, but they aren't what you would call, let's say, an addict, right? There's a natural system. It's like the example I use is like sometimes when someone's when we're severely ill, right? So we could have the flu or something, God forbid. Someone could have the flu or something, God forbid. And then they're like very nauseous, and they have a drink of orange juice, right? And then they vomit. I'm not sorry to use an uncomfortable example. For the next 6 months, they can't even look at orange juice.
Right.
For no reason at all. They could love orange juice, but for the next 6 months, they can't use orange juice. Because part of the bodily system, part of the nature of the way that Hashem created our bodies is that when we encounter something that's negative, it creates a negative association, and we don't want to do that anymore. So many people will fall for a variety of reasons, either because there's underlying traumas, or they're just not in a good place in their life, or they've made a string of bad choices, or they're in a friend environment that's not great. They fall into patterns of drinking too much, let's say, if we're using that example. They used to have a totally normal relationship with alcohol. They go to a new shul, people drink a lot, their friends are encouraging them. Before they know it, like they're coming home every Shabbos, like a little drunk. They're not even sure how. And then one time their wife turns around, and this is just the classic example we're using, is like, what are you doing? You come home drunk like the entire month, every Shabbos, last 4 Shabbosim, and our kids aren't happy. You come in and you fall asleep on the couch. Like, what is with you? And the guy wakes up and he looks in the mirror, and this happens all the time, and is like, oh my God, you're right. I need to be more careful about that. And the reaction to that will be like, either they won't look at vodka again for a very long time, or like, they might have it, but automatically their brain remembers, like, oh, I don't want to have too much because I don't want to go back to that experience because that was really painful, and that's not the man that I want to be. That's the normal system of a human being.
Is that a healthy system?
Yeah, that's a healthy system.
When you say normal,
that's a
healthy system.
That's an adaptive system. Yeah. That's an adaptive, normative, maybe normative is a better word, right? System for a human being. We make bad choices as humans. We interact, and one of the things that we do is, as humans,
a painful mistake that wakes us up and brings us more mindfulness and awareness, and oh wow.
So part of the nature of human beings is our brains love to build habit patterns of behavior. So if we find something that works, we like to do it again and again, right? Because it worked. Sometimes we find something that worked that isn't really good for us, so therefore we can fall into a negative habit pattern. That's addiction. That's one thing. Addicts, in the sense of a mental illness, are people that don't have that reaction, meaning they encounter an addiction, they realize it's a problem, and then as much as they don't want to ever do that again, for whatever reason, that system that makes it gross or reminds them
the automatic correction system is not there.
Is not there. And therefore, they fall into repeated patterns. And even if they stop one addiction, they'll transfer to a different addiction. It's very common. And that's a segment of the population. That's always going to occur. And as much as they know that it's wrong, in that moment, they cannot orient their minds sufficiently to be able to realize that and then arrest the pattern and then engage a new pattern of behavior. So when you're talking about addiction, you're talking about those two things. A built up habituation of negative behavior. That's from a series of events, the wrong social system, maybe trauma, maybe just general liabilities, not feeling great, struggling at work, whatever it is, fall into a negative pattern. The person becomes addicted and then they have to break that addiction. But there's not a sense that they're going to always fall into that. And then there's the mental illness part of addiction, or the illness part of addiction, where there are certain people that they tend to fall into those patterns. They tend to build those patterns very quickly for whatever reason, and their brain, for whatever reason, doesn't have the same type of defense as other people away from those patterns. That's addiction, either that acute state or that chronic state.
I'm very judgmental because I don't know enough about it. Your whole day, every day is researching and evolving with so much research that's coming out on addiction. You can't even keep up with it. It's coming so fast. But when I recovered from my mental illness, it was all about neuroplasticity. My biggest bone to pick with addiction recovery world is if we believe that we can heal our mind and rewire our mind, why are we labeling addicts as addicts? Because once you label, you're never going to move out of it. Are you saying that it's like someone losing a limb? You will never grow a hand. God forbid, if someone loses their hand, they can never grow their own hand. They can have a prosthetic, but they'll never have another arm. Is that what you're saying? You can't rewire your brain that you will never be an addict again. If you were born, you're saying you're born. It's a chemical that, like, is it?
I think it's three things. It's three things. First of all, answer A. No, it's not true. There are many people that fall into patterns of addiction. And then with 90 and the repeated 90-day patterns of rewriting their neural patterns of behavior, they can change their relationship with those things. So people that fall into negative patterns with alcohol use can build healthy patterns with alcohol use.
No matter what they labeled them, if they labeled them an addict, they are an addict.
That would be a false
label.
label.
How does one know?
It's something you have to be willing to look at with an open mind. That's really the answer. Meaning someone that I encounter, there is evidence, which let me just answer that and I want to get back to
okay.
teasing out a really important point. So A, there are many people that fall into a episode of addiction that with smart, mature, methodical work can reestablish a healthy relationship even with recreational drug like alcohol. It's for sure possible. Okay. I've seen it happen.
I want to ask you a question on that I should close the circle for myself. Does that mean that they don't have to go to AA and they don't have to do the one day at a time? They can have Arbacosos, no problem?
It depends on the individual. Definitely in the early phase of recovery, going to 12-step programs is like vitally useful. And by the way, the first step, and this is a point that I've made a number of times in talks that I've given, and I do it in my book, Acceptance, where I talk about a lot of these things that we're talking about right now. People sometimes read the language of the 12-step itself and think they understand the steps. The first step of the 12 steps is figuring out if you're a chronic alcoholic, at least as it's laid out in the big book of AA. What they mean by chronic alcoholic is to a large degree what I was just describing, though there's some more science behind what I'm saying. And not everyone views addiction this way. This is just my experience and my attitude on it. I'm not speaking for the propensity of scientific knowledge and psychological knowledge. This is just what I think, given everything that I've seen. And the innovators of the 12 steps, they keyed into some really intuitive things. And one of the things they keyed into is that some people fall into a pattern of alcoholism that are not what they would call real alcoholics, not chronic alcoholics. That's what Carl Jung called it. That's the language that he used that's quoted in the book Alcoholics Anonymous, the big book of AA. They're not chronic alcoholics, and therefore they can recover totally and normally. That takes time and effort. They have to reintroduce alcohol probably very slowly. They might benefit from going to an AA. And part of going to AA is figuring out, are they a real alcoholic, so to speak? Are they not a real alcoholic? What does that really mean for them? And being abstinent for at least 90 days is a great idea. And that's rooted in science in terms of rewriting those neural pathways and then slowly reintroducing alcohol in a manner that's different than their previous pattern. But now, even if they're not chronic alcoholics, if you just stop drinking and then reintroduce alcohol right away, it's possible you won't have negative consequences, but more than likely you will, because like you said, our brains develop certain patterns and our brain always wants to go back to the old pattern. So until you've reestablished, which takes 45 to 90 days, so until you've created a new pattern, your brain's going to always go back to the old pattern. So it's actually very unwise, which I want to touch on in a moment. There are definitely people that fall into patterns of unhealthy use and they benefit from intervention. Sometimes they benefit from attending 12-step meetings. Part of that process is figuring out, do I really feel like I need to stay here long term? Sometimes that's an experiment. They need to figure out what happens when I reintroduce alcohol. If they reintroduce alcohol without any machshava, then it probably won't go well. But if they use some machshava, slowly reintroducing alcohol, reteaching themselves what healthy, normal drinking is, then some of those people can go back to having a normal life, so to speak. Now, usually they became alcoholic, as you've made that point, they became alcoholic because of underlying traumas and underlying challenges. And if they don't address those, if they don't become alcoholic, find some other negative. So they have to also get help for that stuff.
Right.
But they can reintroduce alcohol in a healthy way. That does happen.
Okay.
I've seen it many times. I've introduced it. I've been involved in people that have tried to do that. There are other people that really from their very early life, it was very obvious for a variety of reasons that they really started off as chronic alcoholic addicts even before they ever used. Their brains tend to build habituated patterns. They go from thing to thing. They're always getting over-attached to things. It's just their nature. Those people are the kind of people that are described as chronic alcoholics. That's not something someone chooses. That doesn't happen because of the volume of alcohol they drink. It's just their nature. That tends to have a good part also, by the way. They're just susceptible. They're very susceptible to these neural patterns. That's my observation. And for whatever reason, like I said, there's not that same kind of inner awareness where if they get sick and then they vomit and they had a cup of orange juice, their body's, I don't want the orange juice. They don't have that natural system. So they tend to fall into those patterns in a repeated way. And therefore, they really need to stay clean and sober forever and ever. So it's not about once an addict, always an addict. It's if you've encountered the full scale of addiction, it's not just episodic, but it's the full scale of addiction. It's unlikely that you'll be able to not fall back into those patterns. Therefore, abstinence and continued work of, let's say, the 12 steps is vital, right? Which is also, by the way, part of the 12 steps is also doing all that other work that I talked about that everyone has. Work and the inner work and the moral inventory and that, right? All that stuff.
Yeah, the looking inward. Yeah, the spiritual work of recovery.
Exactly. 90% of what they do in the 12 steps, all people need to do, especially people that have encountered trauma.
Yes,
right?
yes, absolutely.
But there are things
absolutely.
that the 12 steps does. Okay.
Yeah.
In addition, there's a third category of people, and this is what you're touching on, which is that people that have habituated themselves to being habituated. As we get older, our neuroplasticity reduces, and it becomes much harder for us to write new neural patterns. Whereas a young person, let's say, can fall into a pattern of addiction and then very quickly fix it. And you see that all the time. You have plenty of kids that get addicted to drugs and then they go to yeshiva and they get serious and then they just stop and they never have a problem with drugs ever again. How is that? Because they're 18 years old.
Or they stop for 3 years and they're like, oh, look, I'm not an addict. And then the first crisis in their life, they become an addict
They
again.
fall back in. So that has to do with where they fall. But how does that happen for the ones that never encounter addiction ever again in their life? How does that happen? So it's very obvious. A, they weren't predisposed. And B, their brains are like sponges. And if they develop healthy lifestyles, they're gonna continue that. But if you're 40 and you've built a 25-year career of misusing alcohol, and particularly if you try to stop and then gone back, you've trained your brain that it can't live without alcohol. And there is a point at which you cannot rewrite certain neural patterns. You can try, but there is a point at which you can't. And therefore, those people are very similar to the kind of chronic alcoholics that I was describing. They're not really that different. Therefore, once an addict in that sense, always an addict, because it's just not going to happen. They've already developed that pattern. Their brain is already associated there, and their best chance is to build a life without drugs and alcohol. which is not the most tragic thing in the world.
But will they find a different addiction? Will they find a love
No,
addiction,
so
sex
those,
addiction,
right.
pornography, like other
So
things?
those people are
Okay,
much less likely, actually, to cross addict.
you're saying once in recovery.
Yeah. I'm saying in general, people that are not naturally predisposed to falling into these continuously habituated patterns, but just force themselves into a deep habituated pattern with, let's say, something like drugs and alcohol by continued bad choices. And now they're in their 40s or 50s and they don't have the neuroplasticity that comes along with being 22. It's not
Right.
so easy to rewrite patterns like old people,
Right.
old dogs. It's very hard for old dogs to
Right.
learn new tricks. There's a reason we say those things because it is
Right.
very hard
Right.
for an old dog to learn new
Right.
tricks, where it's very easy for a puppy to learn new tricks. That's just
Okay.
biology.
Okay.
If you have 30 years of life, it's going to be very hard to reintroduce alcohol in a new way. And that's why, by the way, like when you're in that pattern of reintroducing alcohol, let's say for someone who says, I don't think that I'm like a chronic alcoholic, I feel like I just fell into a pattern. You want to be very cautious because every time you fail and then fall into a habituated pattern, you're actually training your brain that you can't live without it, which is then just introducing the addiction in a different way, meaning you're establishing that neural pattern in a deeper and deeper way into your brain's sense of consciousness. So you can, so to speak, make yourself an addict. It makes more sense to be a little bit more cautious about those things and to reintroduce a little slower and to really try to be more thoughtful. If you've encountered a negative pattern around drinking, it really makes sense to be thoughtful and cautious about how you reintroduce and to really try to help yourself learn a new relationship with those things. And maybe you can never just drink without thought. Maybe you always need to have some measure of limit because maybe it doesn't work so well for me. Because once you've had an encounter with once you've encountered alcoholism, you're definitely more susceptible than someone who's never encountered alcoholism
Right.
of falling into an
Right.
alcoholic pattern. It just makes sense to be a little more cautious. Like a variety of illnesses in the body. Once my body goes to a certain place, I want to be cautious about falling into that place again. And therefore I need to take reasonable, common sense measures to protect myself. That's not the same thing as, oh, so you're saying like once an addict, oh, I can never drink again? No, but maybe unrestrained, unthought, unconscious drinking is not good for you. And maybe it
Yeah.
makes sense to be a little limited, whereas your buddy can be more unlimited about it because he doesn't have that experience and he doesn't naturally fall into that pattern. So a lot of this stuff, when you talk about this topic of like alcohol, not alcohol, some of it's communal, some of it's broad, some of it has to do with attitude, but some of it also has to do with the individual being honest with themselves.
I wanted to just say the word that kept on coming in my mind as you're speaking. There needs to be a tremendous amount of self-honesty, like real truth seeking. And
Yes.
it's really hard to get there when you're avoiding life and when life is painful. Like,
Yes.
why would anybody want to get honest?
I think a lot of people want to get honest, but it's scary. But I agree. It requires
I'm
maturity.
saying when it's really hard, why would someone want to get honest? It's so much easier to live in denial than honesty.
It's so much more painful to live in dishonesty than it is to live in honesty.
True. I know, but when a person is running away from so much pain, they won't say that.
That's true. That's true.
I'd rather live in denial than the pain of honesty and truth because it's brutal. It literally, the word that kept on coming up, oh my God, there's honesty, there's real self-reflection. And now I understand. My cousin once told me, no one can lead anybody to recovery but self.
There
No
has
force
to be a
greater.
willingness and openness, to true honesty. And it happens to be that the early adapters of the 12 steps who were so innovative and so thoughtful in many ways about how they develop things, the one thing that they identified that was a barrier to a person having a chance at recovery was not whether they worked all the 12 steps or whether they went to meetings every day or whether they never drink. The one thing that they identified in all of their experience, and this is like in the earlier days, was an inability or an unwillingness to be honest with yourself. That is the one thing they say, that if you're trying to overcome this, particularly this space of reality, and partially because of the reason that I was talking about, because so much of what it means to be human and to have free will is the ability to look at oneself in the mirror and be honest with oneself about where you're holding. Because if you're not being honest with oneself about where you're holding, then you're just a servant to your impulses. You're just a slave to your instincts. And I'm not talking about your feelings. I'm talking about the instinctual reactions that tell me that I need to be protected. So even when you say it's so overwhelming, the truth of it is it's much less overwhelming than it seems. If you want to learn something from addicts, many addicts walk into the rooms of recovery and they'll look at, let's say, like the shade on the wall that has like the 12 steps. And the fifth step is admitted to ourselves, to God, and another human being, the exact nature of our wrongs. And every single one says, or most of them say, I'm never going to do that. And then you talk to them after they've done that, and it's, oh, that wasn't so bad. That actually wasn't at all, that wasn't nearly as scary as it seemed. It's the same thing you talk about like with somebody that's avoiding going to therapy. It feels like if I go to therapy and open myself up, it's going to be excruciating. And for some people it is excruciating, but because of how much toxicity and pain they're holding inside. But for most people, it's invigorating. It's so lightening. It's nothing in comparison to where our mind builds it up, where our mind tells us it's going to be so painful, so overwhelming, so negative, it's going to be so negative. I have to like, you tell me I have to like think about how much I'm going to drink. I'm like, you don't have to obsess about it, but yeah, maybe give it some thought. What's so bad about that? Why can't you just be mature about it? Because a lot of what you're talking about is just having a mature attitude about a mature thing. Drinking is a mature thing. It's not something that you do unrestrained. It's really not. The funny thing is we talk about these topics right before Purim, where the whole central theme of the holiday is the one time of year that we use alcohol, where Judaism says use alcohol in an unrestrained way. Right? So it's funny because we pick on that one time of year to talk about it, but the truth is, for example, if you look in the Be'er Halacha, the Chavetz Chaim says, I don't understand, why are people getting drunk on Purim? It seems like so antithetical to Judaism to lose your mind. And then he makes the point that's essential about it. So if losing your mind is something you practice all year, then you come to Purim and you think, okay, this is just every day. But if losing your mind is something you never want to do, then when you do it on Purim, it's okay, there is a space of holiness within losing your mind.
Wow. I love that. So you're saying it's when we don't use it during the year that it becomes a spiritual thing. And not only permission to adeloyada, it's supposed to, like that one breakthrough.
Right.
That one day to do that breakthrough. But when we're using it just to elevate the unhealthy behavior with it, you did the opposite of the adeloya, the reason.
Right. Exactly. Which is antithetical to the whole point.
Wow, that is so beautiful.
The whole point of using wine for Kiddush is you're taking something that can be so base and negative and you're using it for the opposite purpose. You're elevating it. But then if you distort that, then you lose that. But then someone could ask, but you're saying there's nothing spiritual about the elevated state of losing consciousness and your inhibitions and just being your unrestrained self that people find in alcohol? Isn't that beautiful? And the answer is it is beautiful. And that's why we practice it once a year on Purim. But the message of Judaism is the rest of the year, it's not something you pull out. That's not something you pull out of your bag of spiritual tools. That's something you pull out of your bag of your spiritual tools once or twice a year, maybe Simchas Torah for those people that drink excessively on Simchas Torah, which there are roots in Pnimius Torah and in Torah for doing that. For people that have an immature relationship with alcohol, Purim and Simchas Torah are the times when they finally can be themselves. And they'll even say things like that. And that's such a tragic thing. As opposed to Purim is a time where I unlock a part of myself that normally I keep careful watch over. And Purim, I allow it to emerge and even reveal how there's holiness in that. But in order to do that, I treat drinking with respect throughout the year and treat it with the sanctity that it requires. I've always tried to avoid becoming like an American say what was called a teetotaler. I'm not against drinking, but like when you're removed from it, because alcohol doesn't play a significant role in my life, and you watch people, you can see the people that have taken something really special and degraded it to such an extreme level. And then you like encounter, let's say, I'm thinking of someone in particular that seems to me be a true tzaddik who never drinks. And then you encounter them on Purim and there's something coming from them that's like very otherworldly. It's very like powerful. I'm like, wow, that's what they're talking about. That's what Adela Yada is. That's what they're tapping into. They're tapping into that place. So really it's about getting in touch with what's really going on. It's not about getting high. It's about getting elevated.
The rawness of our soul in the context of the when and how and the mindfulness behind it and the reason of the why. Not just let's get drunk and plastered because you're allowed to. And it says, and not only are we allowed to, we should get to it, but we're not really doing the work that's coming along with the why we're doing it. Like, why don't we teach that? Why don't we teach that to children? Oh, it's permission to become reckless, literally permission to do the usser.
It's a sad thing. I think it's a mistake. I think it's a distortion. It's a sad distortion of what's really there. I think that it's easier. I think we could evaluate a lot of the reasons that we end up in those places as humans. And as humans, we often take some of the most beautiful things and we can fall away because we focus on the wrong point. You were talking about like religion and spirituality. Humans have the capacity to take religion, right? Or let's say Yiddishkeit. Religion is a terrible word to describe what Yiddishkeit is. But we can take Yiddishkeit and we can strip out all the spirituality from it and just make it a mechanical behavior so that God doesn't hate us. It's like the most tragic thing in the world, but it's part of our capacity as humans is that we can do that. In the same light, we can do that with something like alcohol. You can take something that's like a gift from God that can be elevated and you can make it so negative. There's two reasons that society, I think, has done that. First of all, people really struggle with the idea of either browbeating people that are struggling or just being permissive. And there's a space in between where you can just really be honest with people. You're being foolish and you're making a mistake and this is not proper without being overly judgmental. And it's sad and we need to get better about that. So that's part of it. The other part of it is that we have the capacity to take something that's good and make it a higher power. And that happens a lot with alcohol and the Jewish community. For whatever reason, we tend to be very susceptible to those things. We find something, like you see this in the mental health sphere, like a new methodology will emerge and everyone's very excited about it. And for some reason, the frum community, like it becomes the only thing. This is the only methodology that works. Nothing else works. And you see this playing
until
itself
the next
out.
good thing comes out.
Right, and then that's the thing.
It's so
The thing,
true.
it's the only thing. So instead of allowing things to just be a good, we have to make them like the best and
The
the
best.
only. Alcohol can't just be a component of life that elevates. We're either a drinker or an anti-drinker. We're either drinking a lot or drinking a little. There's very little space in between. Why we do that? I don't know, but we tend to do that. We need to tend to move away from those patterns where we can realize like everyone's very preoccupied with psychedelics these days. I'm not like such a big fan anymore. I was open to see. I'm not such a big believer. Whatever it is. I don't
Really?
wanna, like,
Okay,
I'm not
we'll
such
do
a
that
believer.
next episode. What Menachem finds
Okay,
on the
yeah, we can do that.
psychedelic.
I've done it a little. I got into a little bit of trouble, but I don't have like strong feelings about it. My strongest feeling about it is that everyone needs to make it into everything. Instead of like the people that I tend to find have really mature attitudes about it are like, wow, this is a really good tool and maybe I can use it either through microdosing or through the proper application of it.
How can I make it 5 or 10% of my 100% recovery? But this should not be the 100% recovery. But
And
that's
we
with
have a
everything in
tendency
recovery.
to make it be everything. And that's really the only thing I'm opposed to. I'm like nervous about it. I tend to think like people with a history of mental illness and people with a history of addiction really need to stay away from it. And it's very nerve-wracking. But the part that drives me the most crazy, this has just been coming up and I had a conversation with somebody. And I was saying, you're making it everything and it's okay. I'm like, no, I'm not making it everything. But really they are. It's just become the next golden calf. I don't mean to frame it that way, but
I
just
call
became
it the
next
quick
golden
fix.
calf.
I think it's just they think it's the next quick fix and abandon the real soul searching, which recovery is still 120. And I don't say recovery from addiction.
No, I understand. You're talking
Healing,
about the
becoming
broader-
ourselves it's constant. And it's not, okay, let's do one trip and we're going to be okay. It's what is this going to be the avenue to the next thing that will get you to the higher healing, the higher part of yourself.
I don't think it's just rooted in laziness like that. I used to think that, but then I realized that like people put a lot of effort in. I don't mean to sound silly, and it's obviously not silly, but we're so desperate for geula, for a singular force that will solve everything, that like
Mashiach.
we will attach ourselves to anything. We'll make anything a
agree.
Messiah.
I
And that's
agree.
really
I
where
agree.
we fall into these really like destructive patterns instead of saying, okay, this is good for some people and it's not good for others in the right time, in the right way. And in a lot of ways, like you want to talk about what's a healthy use of alcohol. Alcohol is not a solution for everything. And it's something that we need to treat with respect, and it can be useful, and we can make Kiddush on wine, and that can be elevate the wine, and it's Givaldic, and it's holy, and we can have a l'chaim when someone has a simcha, and that can alter our consciousness and awareness, and that can be a good thing. But there's a point at which it seems to me that it's relatively contrary to the perspective of mature Judaism to be a drinker. That shouldn't be your identity. And when it becomes your identity, when you associate with the drinkers but not with the non-drinkers, you've lost something. It's now no longer a tool. It's a place that you're ascribing your identity. I'm a chassid or a Litvish person. I'm a student of this tzaddik or that tzaddik. I'm a drinker and a non-drinker. I'm a bourbon drinker and I'm a scotch guy. That's what you want to attach yourself to? It's so antithetical to the whole thing. And the solution is really to disengage ourselves from that process and to say, okay, we need to treat this with more respect. There are studies that have shown that for a variety of reasons, children of individuals that have recovered from alcoholism are more susceptible to falling into addictive patterns than children of people that never experienced alcoholism. And there are many reasons why the study proposed. And one of the conclusions that they came to, and this is something that is just one study, but it spoke to me very strongly, is that the people that recovered from alcoholism, because they couldn't drink, because they never drank, they never modeled healthy behavior around alcohol to their kids.
The balance.
And then when their kids encountered alcohol, now it could be because there's a biological predisposition, there's a variety of reasons that you could explain, but this is something that struck me as that makes sense. If you're not training kids from a young age what healthy drinking looks like, and then when they turn 20 and they're just doing an exaggerated version of what the men in their shul did, why are you surprised? This is what you've trained them to think is normal. That's really the solution that you're talking about, is that we need to get more honest. We need to realize that alcohol is a serious thing, that we can't just ignore it, and that having dry shuls is not necessarily the most effective solution. Never having alcohol is not necessarily the solution. I'm not advocating to have alcohol or not to have alcohol, but if you get rid of all the alcohol in your shul, you haven't necessarily solved the problem, because a lot of shuls that have no alcohol in it have a house across the street where men are doing the exact same thing. But now they're not doing it in
but
shul.
maybe it shouldn't be the place. Maybe they should be dry shuls and they should be at home with kiddush. That should be like the standard.
It could be, but I'm just saying, again, trying to create dry shuls is, again, trying to ascribe a messianic solution to a broader problem. It could be a dry shul is useful. It could be a communal effort, and maybe it's not viable, but maybe it is. Maybe the size of the shul matters. A communal effort to have healthier drinking going on in the shul. And when somebody is stepping out of line, instead of judging them, for the community to band together and say, this doesn't seem to be working for you. And maybe that means limiting the type of alcohol, limiting the amount of alcohol, being cautious about who drinks when you're in shul, being cautious about when you have alcohol present in the shul. Maybe you only have alcohol for certain circumstances. I think it's a complicated question that's somewhat subjective. But the point is that these kind of like sledgehammer solutions for knocking in a delicate nail, either no rules or all the rules, don't necessarily solve the problem that substance use is present in society, and us pretending it's not there or just swimming in it is not the solution, and that the Jewish people need to be a light unto the nation, and we need to demonstrate what it looks like to have healthier, more mature attitudes. And if it means a Rav getting up and talking about it, not scolding people.
But they'll say, I don't know. No, they'll say, I don't know anything about alcohol. I'm not an alcohol specialist. What do you want me? I know how to talk about the Dvar Torah from the Parsha. I don't know anything about.
I don't think it requires an alcohol specialist. I think it just requires maturity. It's not different than any other area of life. It just requires an awareness as a community, like, guys, we've gone off the rails. Let's, as a community, band together to teach our children what healthy looks like. And if somebody's unhealthy, to say, when you're exhibiting those unhealthy things, we're not going to pretend that's not problematic. We're not going to ignore it. Now, listen, that's not going to solve all the problems. There's always going to be alcoholics who are always going to push the limits. There's always going to be narcissists that like really push the limits. And there's always going to be people that are immature who are push the limits. In order for a solution to make sense, it doesn't have to get rid of all the problems. In order for it to make sense, it has to make sense. And the sensible thing is that we need it to reintroduce, you're asking me, so these are my perspectives, right? I don't know anything.
Educate. You're saying educate properly. And instead of
without being sensational about it.
But I guess it's the same thing about everything. They say, what about phones for little children and like TikTok for a 10-year-old? Are you going to say, oh, everything with moderation, take TikTok? TikTok is going to destroy your life. At what point do we allow the child, or maybe it shouldn't be a children thing, I don't know, but bringing alcohol to a place where there's not such monitoring of children, the children will eventually drink. So are we setting up for failure? Because how many kids are really intellectually honest with themselves?
No, it's not about the kids, but if you create a culture where the community as a group bands together to try to create an environment that exhibits health, it's going to have an effect. You're saying that no kids won't steal away? I don't think that there should just be alcohol flying everywhere. But there's a difference between having a Kiddush and Shul, and there's a moderate amount of alcohol present, and maybe it's type, and a moderate amount of drinking done, and a point at which maybe the Rav goes up and says, guys, like it's really gotten out of hand lately and we're drinking too much. Like the chevra's drinking too much. We really need to get a handle on this. For the next few weeks, let's not drink. For the next few weeks, let's practice being ruchnius, like ruchniistic, without drinking. And then in a few weeks from now, we're going to add a few bottles, and we really want everyone to practice it together. I'm not saying such craziness. I understand that's not the way that people talk, but that's what's necessary. It's the same thing with, okay,
Yeah,
the reason
you're
why we
saying
don't
we
give
need
kids,
honesty. We
Yes.
need honesty.
we need to be intellectually
But
honest with ourselves.
that's a big ask. That's a
That-
big ask.
and that's state of
Alevai.
affairs. That's a sad state of affairs if we can't be honest with ourselves. That's essentially
No,
what we
really.
need.
Do you really think a rabbi will get up? You know what would happen? There's a Kiddush down the block. Sometimes the correction needs to be extreme in order to start from ground zero. And
So
say,
a good rabbi understands that there's a lot of political mechanisms in having a community. And before he just gets up and gives a sledgehammer speech, which again, I'm not talking about a sledgehammer speech and saying drinking is bad and you're bad, and right? But I'm talking about talking to the chevra and saying, guys, we have to be good examples, and the community's really gone out of hand. But part of that is also making the effort to try to recruit people towards this effort to make the community more healthy and trying to get those community leaders to be leaders. And that's part of what it means to be a Rav. But you're right. It's not just about the Rabbonim. It's also about the people in the shul being real leaders and being honest with themselves and saying we have a responsibility for our kahila to create an environment of health, to create an environment of normalcy where we make living in an elevated fashion normal. I understand what I'm saying it's odd that it sounds radical, but I don't think it's that
it's
radical.
sad. It
getting
is so
real.
radical. It is so radical, but so important. And
I think it's
and
real.
it
I
goes
think we
back.
should just get real with
I
ourselves.
know, but how many people are actually in shul being real? How many people are really going because they want to be spiritual,
So
connected?
then the
and
problem
daven
is
and-
not alcohol. Then the problem is not
Exactly.
alcohol. That answer, right?
Exactly.
That's not a
Exactly.
problem of alcohol. That's a problem of we
Thank
don't want to
you.
be real. Right? Okay, so I agree with you.
Exactly. But for the little kids, what do you think we should do for chinuch-wise for little kids? Should we be a part of it as a parent? Should we say, okay, listen, before 21, I know everybody is drinking in shul. There's no drinking. They go to Israel. 18, they're going to Israel. They're drinking. They become
think that
so
each
addicted
parent-
to alcohol there.
Listen, and this conversation is not, what I'm about to say is not for parents that are exhibiting teenagers that are unruly and exhibiting risky behavior, but for the kind of normative or adaptive parent who has an adaptive child, it is important to introduce alcohol at moderated levels from the time they're even 16, 17. And that's just common sense. Meaning from the time that a kid is 16, 17, that messaging is other people do this, but we don't do this. Alcohol is a serious thing. And then from the time that they're 16 and 17, giving them small amounts, that in a manner that's supervised by parents. And as they get older, allowing a little more, allowing them to experiment, allowing them to even experiment as they get 18 and 19 to get inebriated. Because you're right, they go to Israel. And if they haven't been trained what normal is, and a parent hasn't been honest with them and says, some people are not normal. And I don't mean normal in the pejorative sense. They're not normative. They're not adaptive. Whatever the word is, that's not healthy, right? Some people are not healthy. We're not going to judge them. That is not healthy. I want you to have an experience that's healthy. Let's work on this together. And I know that many teenagers will not be responsive
Yeah,
to this.
how many teenagers are going to say, oh, thank you for telling me that?
Many teenagers, if you
Really?
start working with, yes, I've been working with teens for my whole career. It can be difficult for a parent to establish that relationship, but if you begin to talk to your children when they're 13 and 14, like they're real human beings, and you begin to acknowledge that they have autonomy and that they have real thoughts, and you can have real adult-like conversations, and you elevate the conversation more and more as they get older, when they get to 16 and 17, you can have a real conversation with them. If you treat them like they're 6 when they're 14, meaning you do this because I told you to, and you haven't engaged them, then when they're 16, you can't control them anymore. You can't have the conversations I'm talking about. But if you engage kids and demonstrate that you respect them as people, and you also exhibit the fact that you're going to matter-of-factly you're going to give them autonomy where it's appropriate, but also exert your parental responsibility when it's appropriate. If you do that, yes, kids will listen. They might not like it. They might be upset at you. They might say you're weird, or stop it, or why can't you be like my friend's parents? But they don't actually believe those things. They'll say that because they're frustrated. But deep down inside, I've worked with enough teens to know they really appreciate that their parents are showing up for them. And there's this misnomer that like kids are just these irrational lunatics. Sometimes they are. But
Yeah.
a lot of times, even if you haven't established that relationship by the time they're 13 and 14, and this is something I've talked to parents a lot. If you have a really like toxic relationship with your 16-year-old, stop expecting it just because you decided that you want your relationship to not be toxic, that it's going to take 2 weeks for the relationship to not be toxic. Spend 6 months reasserting trust in the relationship.
Trust,
Spend
exactly.
6 months.
Exactly.
The kid might act out in that 6 months, and you could try to limit it to the best of your ability. But I promise you, if you reestablish the trust in the relationship, and you begin to get to that place where they start to trust you, then suddenly you can start to assert yourself in the relationship. Now, again, I'm not talking about kids that have encountered trauma, who are now exhibiting all sorts of risky behavior. Not every kid that exhibits risky behavior has experienced trauma, but most of them have. Let's be honest. That's a different story. What to do with that?
Right.
There's
Right.
other people you should have on to talk about how to
Right.
encounter those kids.
Right.
But when we talk about teens, most teens are not that way. Most teens care about their well-being. They want to make their parents proud. They want to be successful. They want to be liked by their friends. They want that more than anything. And they want to be cool. And they want to be that's what they want. But they also want their parents to be proud of them. And if we leverage that and engage them there, we can have success. And if we have conversations with them about what normal is, and again, I don't mean that in the immature, pejorative sense, but what sensible is, what Hashem wants from us, what a healthy life looks like. And we say, I know that it's hard for you, but I really want you to wait until next year. Let's try to wait till next year. And then next year, we'll try to introduce a little bit of alcohol on Purim, and we'll see how that is. And we'll talk about it. And maybe stretch your boundaries a little bit. And maybe introduce it. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world for parents. I sometimes get a lot of flack for this, but I don't think that it's necessarily bad for parents to introduce very subtle levels of alcohol from the time their kids are already at an age where other kids are over drinking. I think it's sensible at times in a supervised environment, let's say like at a Purim Suda, to say, I know that normally we don't drink, but you can have a glass of wine or 2 glasses of wine even. And then we're going to talk about how it felt after. And that's actually really good. I felt really flighty and I felt out of control. How do you feel now at the end? Are you proud of it? Are you not proud of it? Did that make sense? Did that not make sense?
I don't think most teens are going to say, oh, you know what? I was dizzy. I was a little nauseous, because their manlyhood of becoming, I could drink, is at risk if they become vulnerable.
I think that's only if you've not established trust and honesty in your relationship with your kid, which is very hard.
I think it all goes back to trust with ourselves,
And
trust in the relationship. Yes.
And I will say that a lot of these times, these conversations can only happen between sons and mothers. And sometimes they can only happen between fathers and sons.
Yeah.
And the opposite with girls also. And you have to be cognizant of that. And it's also subjective to the relationship. Because if you don't have parental unity on these things and the mom wants to talk to their son about something, the son's not going to receive it because it's not comfortable. And it's really something he has to hear from his dad. But if you have both parents engaged, we're talking about the ideal circumstance, right? We're not talking about what do you do when that's not the case. But if we're talking about where both parents are engaged and involved, it's strategically working these things out. So sometimes it's the father on his way home from shul saying, oh, did you see those guys? I think they drank too much. What do you think about it? Your kid saw it. Let's say your kid didn't even see you. But you go to shul and you know those guys are acting like buffoons. Don't not talk about it. And don't be like, look at those morons. They're stupid. That's not going to be helpful because those guys look really cool. You need to talk to your kids about that. Oh, isn't that weird? Do you think that's good? Do you think that's bad? What do you think is normal? What do you think is not normal? All the things that we're talking about, we need to talk to kids about. Just like all the things that we're talking about, Rabbonim need to sit down and talk about for real. But it's very difficult for people to like step outside of themselves and just get real. I think sometimes. I think that's the point that you were making, but I think that's the solution. We need to just get real.
Tell me if I'm correct that the way orthodoxy is leading now, it's not what's manufacturing addicts. It's our lack of emotional trust with ourselves and honesty that's manufacturing it. If you're saying if they'll find it anywhere, if somebody's running, they'll find it in shul, in their friend's house, somewhere. I want to conclude, are we the source of this unbelievable generation of addiction to substance abuse and alcohol? Are we helping it? Can we do anything to prevent it? Should be the answer. Is there anything we could do and I'm understanding from you having healthy conversations, being honest, is the antidote.
Yes. And I think that it's not just the sense that we're manufacturing addiction. We exist. We sometimes feel from communities like we exist in a bubble, and we don't exist in the bubble. Substance abuse in this country, in the United States, is out of control. And even though as an Orthodox community we experience it at a lesser degree, but we experience everything that exists outside of the Orthodox community exists within the Orthodox community at a different level. But we aspire to live in a more elevated way, and the only way for us to live in that elevated way in this topic is to talk about it, to talk about what healthy drinking looks like, to talk about the fact that people that struggle with drinking are not bad, to talk about the fact that a segment of the population, no matter what you do, is going to encounter addiction in some facet, and that's not their fault.
What's the percentage of that, by the way?
Is
there a percentage? Is it
20%.
3%, 10%?
10 to 20% of the population will encounter at some point some type of like unhealthy experience of alcoholism or addiction.
Worldwide.
That's like the broader population.
Okay.
But whatever, even if you think it's 3%, 5%, it's a percentage.
Yeah, okay.
We just need to be aware of that. What we are manufacturing is really distorted, unhealthy attitudes about what it means to like live life in an elevated fashion, because we break everything down into like bad and good. This bad, this good.
Or allowed or not allowed.
Yeah.
Allowed or not allowed versus spiritual, not spiritual, godly, not godly. What does Hashem want? What does Hashem want?
There is also, you did make the point that there are things that are usser that we're not meant to moderate. You talked about like cell phones, like smartphones or apps. I don't think anyone should be on TikTok ever. It's an abusive platform that's built to try to attach itself to kids' brains and get them addicted.
But isn't alcohol the same in a way?
No, I don't think alcohol is built that way. No, I think TikTok was designed by very smart people who specifically, they want to invade our minds. There are social media apps in general. Some social media apps are necessary, some are not. TikTok happens to be one it's very public knowledge that the Chinese government created TikTok because they designed it that way on purpose. But smartphones, social media apps, those are designed to try to get our attention. I'm not saying not to be on social media apps. I'm not saying not to have a smartphone. Some people need to have them. Some people benefit from not having them. The point is, there is a layer within Judaism where something transcends a level where we're supposed to try to moderate it, and it becomes usser. That idea exists in Judaism, where some things we're supposed to try to moderate and some things we're not supposed to try to moderate. So the question is, are we supposed to moderate alcohol? It's pretty clear that the Eibishter wants us to moderate alcohol. It's in the program. Are we supposed to moderate marijuana or not? I don't know. That's a good question.
I like that. And we have to do that real soul searching. First of all, knowing what will we have to moderate or not, what is unacceptable or not. I don't know. It's a very good question, but I like that clarity that you gave me. If somebody would say that happened, but he was drunk, give him a pass. He did X, Y, and Z when he was drunk. Is that a pass, or is that Adam nimdad bekiso koso v'kaso? Can we say that really?
I think it's a little bit of both. We have to hold people accountable to what they do when they're drunk, but we have to understand that part of getting drunk is a loss of inhibition. But I think that using it as an excuse to not hold people accountable for what they do is dangerous, because it justifies really toxic behavior. And if someone drank so much that they had no inhibition at all over what they did, then even if they're not responsible for what they did, they're responsible for drinking that much. And if they can't control that, then they have a problem with alcohol, and then they're responsible to get help. I think that's like a very important line of demarcation that we have to make in our lives. I remember I had a mashgiach in yeshiva that talked about like Rav Dessler's line of bechira. We always have to be honest. Again, this goes back to that honesty piece about what our frame of bechira is. If we drank so much that we did something inappropriately, then we need to not drink so much. And if we can't not drink so much, then we need to look at our drinking. And if we can't not look at our drinking, we need to look at why we can't look at our not drinking. There's always a point of accountability. And what a person needs to focus on is, what is your point of accountability? Just because you're unaccountable for something further down the line doesn't mean that there's not a layer of a place that you should look at. And we want to focus on that place, that point of bechira, so to speak, where I need to take a look at that. So if a guy's so out of control that he can't control his drinking, then fine, I'm not going to hold you accountable for what you did while you were drinking, but I will hold you accountable for the fact that your drinking is out of control. Right? I'm not going to ignore that just because I can't ignore that. You need to take a look at that. And we need to hold people as a society, we need to hold those people accountable to that. Again, that doesn't mean to judge them, and it doesn't mean to like point a finger at them, but it does mean to be honest with them that their behavior is unacceptable. And that goes back to what we were saying before. There is a point where something becomes unacceptable. And at the point that it's unacceptable, part of what our spiritual heritage teaches us, you say that's unacceptable. But at a point that something's not unacceptable, you don't call it unacceptable. We have to be very precise and honest about where we're holding, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for that. If there was anybody in the history from Adam and Eve going into Jewish history, if there was any one person you can meet and ask them a question, who that person would be and what question would you ask them?
That's so hard.
Who do you aspire to? Who do you want to know more?
It's very hard. It's a very hard thing.
And you could say, you know what, I'm not prepared to answer.
I'll give you the list. I don't know what I would ask, but it goes without saying, if I could, I'd be terrified to encounter most people, starting from the Rishonim. It'd be really exciting to see someone like the Arizal, to meet Rabbi Menachem of Breslov or the Alter Rebbe of Chabad. But maybe someone I'd love to interact with and talk to is Menachem Begin. I'm fascinated by Menachem Begin. He's because I wouldn't be terrified of him.
Oh, okay.
Like,
you would be inspired, but not.
I wouldn't be able to talk to them. I asked them a question. I could barely talk to Tzaddikim that are around today. I know. Menachem Begin, I'd love to sit in his living room and pick his brain. Particularly what it means to be a Jew to him. I'm very enamored. I know because he wrote a lot, but I'm very enamored by the passion by which he connected with what it means to be a Jew from a humanistic perspective, but that was very deeply rooted in our Masorah. And I'm very touched by him, even though clearly Menachem Begin was a complicated figure, but there was a certain tamimus in him that I very much deeply admire in terms of a secular kind of, so to speak, Jewish personality that I wouldn't be terrified of, if that answers your question.
Okay. I like that. I like that. So he has an innate Gava Yehudit that you're curious about. Thank you very much for your time. You answered a few of my questions, but I think what I left here, you taught me a tremendous amount. That is about honesty and really spirituality, having the conversations. It's not about the what, it's about the inner work, and it's constant. And it's not about avoiding, it's learning ourselves, going the vulnerability and starting these conversations versus ignoring it and pretending it's okay or not okay.
Yes.
I'm going to ask you a question that I had this conversation with my son. My son came back from yeshiva last year. He was in yeshiva for 2 years. And I was curious. I know that I'm probably ignorant in this field. He was telling me that they do this program. It's called Shmiras Einayim, Shmiras Abris. And he was explaining to me that they get all these bonuses and if they show up and they're being honest. And he said that they said to them, if you don't do it for yourself, do it for your wife, your future wife.
Do I think that that's ridiculous?
If you want to get Menachem's answer on this question, you will need to join the Listening to Understand WhatsApp community. So head over to WhatsApp, go to communities, look for Listening to Understand, join the community. We will have other articles that are specific for the community. And every episode, we're going to take out exclusive content that only members of the community will get access to. If you think that anyone you know can benefit from this conversation, please forward it to them. You might save a marriage. You might help a future generation. We have to do this together. I'm committed to the process of finding the topics that need to be discussed. I need you to share, to be a part of us, and to give us your ratings and review. Please go to iTunes and give us your honest review, good or bad or in between. We would love to hear. And if you have any suggestions, please email us. All of the links are in the show notes. Menachem, thank you for your work. Thank you for your time.
Okay,
Such a powerful conversation. I appreciate every single moment. Bye till next time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Understand. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please hit that follow button on your favorite podcast app. This way you don't miss an episode and you help us grow. You are part of our growth. We appreciate your support and we hope you choose to listen to us on our next episode. We'd love to hear from our audience. If there's anything you would like us to research, to talk about, please contact us on our website, listeningtounderstand.com. And if there's any insight that you got from this and you want to share with others and you are happy for us to read it out loud on our show, send us your insights, send us your thoughts. We want to listen to understand. Bye till next time.